Brother Herman Van Selm, a helper to the writing committee, will help us review some of the key points of the prophecy recorded in Daniel 11. Thank you, Herman, for helping me with this presentation.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Ken. Thank you for inviting me.
So again, this month's JW Broadcasting episode is all about Bible prophecy, specifically Bible prophecies that somehow relate to Jehovah's Witnesses and specifically to the way they're being persecuted at the moment in Russia. And it's interesting that Kenneth Cook, a governing body member, apparently can't do this on his own. He needs to call in the cavalry in the form of governing body helper Herman Van Selm, who we've seen on previous JW Broadcasting episodes, although Herman is sort of on the B list when it comes to governing body helpers. Poor Herman, I shouldn't be too unkind. But yeah, he isn't quite on the A list of governing body helpers when it comes to presenting JW Broadcasting episodes or doing parts on the conventions. But they do bring him out now and then, and interestingly, on this occasion, Kenneth Cook needs Herman to explain this incredibly complicated, convoluted, frankly nonsensical interpretation of Daniel's prophecy in Daniel chapter 11.
Let's briefly trace how the prophecy has been fulfilled so far. The prophecy in Daniel 11 mentions the king of the north.
No, stop it. As I've already explained, it's the king of the north, not the king in the north. This has absolutely nothing to do with some weird competition involving kings and thrones.
These powers could be viewed as two thrones. Over time, those thrones have been occupied by various political powers, and these rival kings compete for world domination.
Okay, I give in. Apparently, Daniel chapter 11 is just some rubbish early draft of a well-known HBO series, just with more needless ambiguity and fewer dragons, ice zombies, and boobs.
And what about Jehovah's people? They are right at the center of this conflict. But let's start at the beginning. Ken, what is the origin of the kings of the north and of the south?
The kings of the north and of the south both rose from the empire established by Alexander the Great. One line of kings ruled over Egypt, which is south of Israel, and that dynasty was the first to fill the role of king of the south. During this period, another line of kings ruled an area north of Israel, and those kings filled the role of king of the north. Then, the Roman Empire took over as king of the north.
Now, wait a minute. Let's think about that a minute.
Yes, thank you, David. We should think about this because what we've just heard is, broadly speaking, accurate until it starts branching off into nonsense. So first of all, it's worth commenting that Herman Van Selm, again, has been brought in to help Kenneth Cook. But apparently, for all of the really deep, profound things, he needs to hand over to Kenneth. Because Kenneth is, after all, a governing body member. So the whole thing is kind of very obviously rigged to emphasize Kenneth's relative authority compared to Herman. Herman is there to really point to Ken and the rest of the governing body as being the true fonts of knowledge when it comes to understanding Bible prophecy. As to what we've just heard about the king of the north and the king of the south, and these relating to the breakup of Alexander's empire, that's actually accurate. When you refer to what scholars have to say about Daniel chapter 11, they agree that this is basically the history of the Middle East following the breakup of Alexander's empire, written from the point of view of prophecy or written in prophetic language. Where they do not agree is this whole stuff about Rome. And Rome is significant to Jehovah's Witnesses because they need to spin this whole narrative so that it somehow connects with our times, with the modern age. That's where the Jehovah's Witness narrative and the narrative of Bible scholars completely separates, because they are all about emphasizing their relevance and their authority. Because as you heard, Herman said, this is all about God's people. Jehovah's Witnesses consider themselves to be God's people. They can't read a prophecy like Daniel 11 and not see themselves in it or want to insert themselves into it. So they need the time span to somehow be stretched into the 20th and 21st century. And that's why they start involving Rome. And as we're going to see, nations and groups of nations much further along in the timeline from Rome, they need to make this about them. It's, again, shoehorning Bible prophecy into modern history and specifically the history of Jehovah's Witnesses.
As discussed in the May 2020 Watchtower, God's people are the focal point of the prophecy recorded in Daniel chapter 11. The angel who spoke with Daniel said that the prophecy would help him understand what will befall your people, that is, the nation of Israel.
And what, in fact, happened? Well, the Jewish nation was God's people until 33 CE. But after that, a change occurred. Jehovah poured out his Holy Spirit on Christ's followers, and from then on, the congregation of true Christians became God's people. Galatians 6, verse 16 refers to them as the Israel of God.
That point is significant because the kings of the north and south can only be identified when there is a clearly defined group of God's people on earth. Why is that the case? Because, as we just considered, the angel had told Daniel that the prophecy centers on God's people.
In the 2nd century CE, true Christians were overgrown by wheat-like false Christians. In his illustration of the wheat and the weeds, Jesus foretold that this would happen. That illustration is recorded at Matthew 13, verses 36 to 43. So, from the 2nd century onward, we can no longer identify an organized group of true Christians. And as we considered, for that same reason, we also cannot identify the king of the north and the king of the south.
But in the 1870s, a group of Bible students began to separate itself from false Christians. This group, which included Charles T. Russell, rejected teachings that were not based on the Bible. And like the 1st century Christians, they promoted the truths taught in God's Word.
Now, this group underwent a development that is foretold at Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. They were the messenger who would clear up a way before Jehovah.
And as events that followed prove, this group clearly had God's backing.
So what we've just been witnessing feels like some kind of weird two-piece boy band act.
I don't care who you are, where you're from, don't care what you did, as long as you love me.
Where Kenneth Cook, again, the senior man in this presentation, because he is the governing body member, Kenneth Cook and Herman Van Selm are kind of riffing off each other, giving this presentation. I think there's some psychology going on here, by the way. I think the reason why Kenneth needs to drag Herman into the equation is to essentially bully Jehovah's Witnesses psychologically. I think that's what's happening. Because what they're describing is so ridiculous and so preposterous. It sounds bad enough when there are two people saying it, but when there's one person saying it, psychologically you're thinking, okay, this guy's losing the plot a little bit here, but it's just this guy. You know, it's not like this is what everyone believes or what everyone's expected to believe in the organization. But when there's two men doing it, there's a little bit of a good cop, bad cop thing going on. And again, Jehovah's Witnesses are sort of being psychologically manipulated and coerced into thinking, well, there are two people here that take this all very seriously, one of whom is a governing body member. I should believe this. I have to believe this. Because if it's good enough for these two guys, it needs to be good enough for me. Honestly, I couldn't help but watch this and kind of think, bring back David Splane with his pointy stick.
Now, do you know of many who were of the anointed in 1914 and who outlived brother friends? There may have been some, but not many.
This is the sort of material where you would be crying out for David Splane with his incredibly arrogant, pompous, condescending tone. We've now got the next best thing, which is apparently Herman Van Salm and Kenneth Cook in front of a flat screen monitor, which is giving these, again, ridiculous timelines, trying to persuade Jehovah's Witnesses that Daniel chapter 11 is somehow about them. It can't simply be a commentary on the struggle between the Ptolemaic kingdom and the Seleucid kingdom, written at that time, which is what becomes manifestly obvious when you do any amount of digging on this. It can't just be as simple as that. No, it has to stretch somehow into our times, and specifically, this prophecy has to involve Jehovah's Witnesses somehow. And two things become immediately apparent to me in the way they're trying to, again, coerce people using these visual displays in the background. First of all, they keep showing this picture of the immense image from Daniel chapter 2. This is a different prophecy in Daniel, and this prophecy is actually significant because when I was a Jehovah's Witness and I received the Daniel's prophecy book at the 1999 convention, one of the things that really confused me and actually caused me to, for the very first time, start doubting the whole narrative was the fact that the immense image explanation or interpretation conflicts with the King of the North interpretation. So when you read what this book has to say about the immense image, it talks about the legs of iron resulting in the feet of iron mixed with clay. And it says the legs of iron, well, that's Rome. And the iron mixed with clay, that's Anglo-America, which came from Rome. And it uses some quite convoluted explanation to say, well, Britain is effectively an offshoot of the Roman Empire. Britain was once controlled by the Roman Empire, and so it makes sense that the feet are themselves partly made of iron because they're partly from the Roman Empire, but they're mixed with clay because they're not as strong as the Roman Empire. That's what this book is essentially saying. It's saying that in this prophecy in Daniel chapter 2, Britain comes from the Roman Empire. And then when it's explaining Daniel chapter 11, the King of the North, King of the South prophecy, it uses this convoluted reasoning to suggest that Rome actually became the King of the North, Nazi Germany. In one prophecy, bear in mind again, all of this was apparently written down by Daniel to make it easier for God's people to understand what was happening in the time of the end. All of this is supposed to make things less complicated than there being no prophecy whatsoever and people just observing events unfold. This is supposed to make things less complicated. And we're supposed to believe, at least according to this book, we were supposed to believe that in one prophecy in Daniel chapter 2, Rome becomes Anglo-America. And in another prophecy, Daniel chapter 11, for complicated reasons, Rome actually becomes Nazi Germany, the opponent of Britain and America. And that was a reason why I couldn't take this book seriously and why I struggled with this book, even as a 19, 20-year-old Jehovah's Witness. And obviously I buried those doubts. But this brings me to my second point, and this is a deviation from the Daniel's Prophecy book. You'll notice that Herman and Kenneth are using reasoning to effectively say, we don't need to worry about who the king of the north was between the first century Christians and Jehovah's Witnesses. We don't need to explain that anymore, because the king of the north, king of the south prophecy is purely about God's people. And if there isn't a group of people on the earth who can be identified as God's people, then the prophecy no longer matters. There's no need to go through any lengthy explanation of who the king of the north, king of the south was at any given point in history, especially when we're talking about a point in history when we've decided arbitrarily that there was no group of God's people at that time, which again flies in the face of this book, published as recently as 1999, which gives charts on almost every page explaining who the king of the north or king of the south was at almost any point in history. For example, if you look at the chart on page 246, maybe you can just about make out there's a little figure with a horse, and then there's a chart above. And the chart says at the top, king of the north, king of the south, and it lists Augustus, Tiberius, Aurelian. It says Daniel chapter 11, verses 25 and 26 refers to Caesar Aurelian. And in these verses, the king of the south was Queen Zenobia. In fact, probably a better chart to show you is the chart on page 284 of the book. Look at this. So this goes into a summary of the king of the north, king of the south. And somewhere around here, it lists Augustus, Tiberius, Aurelian. If you go on Wikipedia, you find out that Aurelian was Roman emperor between as late as 270 and 275. And yet what have we just learned? We've just learned that there was an apostasy much earlier than that, and God's people couldn't be identified. Well, that wasn't what this book was saying. This book was saying that as late as 270, 275 CE, by which point, according to what we've just heard, the apostasy was well underway. The Daniel book was suggesting as recently as 1999 that the king of the north, king of the south prophecy could be explained in between. And it again went through some extremely convoluted reasoning involving the Austrian House of Habsburg and Emperor Charlemagne and all of this stuff. I won't bore you with it all, but it literally connected Rome with Nazi Germany and went through all of this convoluted reasoning to suggest how the king of the north went from being Rome to being Nazi Germany. And now, in 2021, because of new light, Herman Van Salm and Kenneth Cook know differently. Apparently Jehovah was lying to the faithful slave when he inspired this book. Apparently now it's all clear and obvious. When there isn't a clearly defined group of people on the earth who can be approved by Kenneth Cook and his pals as being God's one true people, Daniel 11 is apparently silent.